words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. He's called Father Abraham. Father spiritually, at least to Jews and Christians and Muslims, because all three religious traditions point to and remember him as their spiritual ancestor. Not bad for a Bedouin sheep herder, huh? We need to think about that for a minute, since the Bedouin way of life is so very different than our own. Every day of his life, Abraham slept in a tent. No house, no permanent home, just wandering as he was following his herd wherever they might wander to graze, all over the area in the Middle East that we now call Israel. And yet, Abraham didn't just have sheep and goats. For you see, Abraham had a promise from God. 4 times previously, by my count, he believed that God had promised to give him land and children. Now that was a particularly significant thing to promise, because besides just meaning that you had offspring to love, land and descendants meant that your line continued. You had a future in that precarious world. But by the time we pick up the story today, Abraham is growing long in the tooth, and he has neither land nor children. So it seems the promise is starting to fade a bit. In today's reading, God comes to Abraham and he reminds him again of the promise, leading Abraham to say, "But I'm an old man. How can it be that I would have a child?" And then we hear that God took Abraham out into the night and says, "Look at the stars in the heavens. As many stars as there are in the sky, so shall your descendants be." The story says that Abraham once again believed God, and that belief was counted as righteousness. Now that's an interesting word, righteousness. If you think that righteousness means being scrupulous and always moral and always pious and upright, well, you don't know Abraham. And you better go back and read his story in the book of Genesis again. In many ways, Abraham was quite a rascal. But his belief, his trust that God would keep God's promises, that was what made him a righteous man. Now, does that mean that he never wavered in that belief? Of course not. We heard that today. He was human, just like us. And yet, God, with infinite patience, just kept promising. So, Abraham was not an example of someone with blind faith. In fact, I suspect a part of him probably got a little angry at times. Certainly he got impatient. See, faith and trust are not laid out in some sort of straight path, are they? They come with a lot of bumps and valleys along the way. In fact, I think that's part of the point. Faith is not about blind acceptance, but it is about relationship. So the events surrounding the life of Abraham are more than just ancestral tales. They become the voice of God to the people of God, saying, "Do not be afraid. In other words, just stay in relationship with me, and I will walk those journeys with you. And so, despite the difficulty in doing so and all evidence to the contrary, Abraham trusted in God to keep God's promises in God's good time. God's time. God's time. We often hear that referred to as Kairos time, as opposed to Chronos time, which is the word for our quantitative way of timekeeping. And I might add, this crazy system that caused us to all lose an hour's sleep this morning. Thank you, Josh, for scheduling me to preach today. In the end, Abraham trusted that in this fullness and transcendence of God's time, all would be fulfilled. That's an important concept for us to consider during this Lenten season, because so often we have lost the ability to trust in anything that doesn't come to pass right in front of our eyes, right now. We're an impatient lot, and I know that because I'm the worst. How often I have prayed, God, give me patience, but I want it now. To be fair, everything in our culture tells us that we need to move fast and see results. It goes all the way back to Sesame Street, really. We are programmed to think that way, aren't we? Our news is couched in little sound bites. We push a button on the computer and we expect to get an answer. We want God to fulfill God's promises right now, or we are just not going to believe in God. But today's reading tells us that God has made a covenant with our ancestor. And even though that ritual sounds odd, and we are not acting that out, by the way, it sounds very odd to our 21st century ears, it is a ritual of promise. A promise that began with 4 simple words. Do not be afraid. And like Abraham, we ask, how can that be? Of course, what is implicit in that covenant is that God's in charge. That God will be with us. That God is at work underneath everything. Now, I suspect that some of you may dismiss this as too easy and too superficial an answer. Kind of a bright, sunny sort of theology that fails to answer the question of suffering. At times when I get discouraged about the state of the world, I can still hear my father say to never forget that we are just barely a hair's breadth on the chronological timeline of this planet, and that ethically and morally, we are not far from hanging in the trees. In other words, God is not done with us yet. This is about God's time, not ours. Here at the start of the Lenten season, when we are called to reflect on the barren places of our lives, it's helpful to do that with an attitude and a trust in God, even in the emptiness and the doubt. God is doing a new thing, we hear, and we long for that to be true in spite of evidence to the contrary. There's war, and there's a pandemic, and hatred, and division, and fears about global warming, and inflation, and an anxiety-driven economy. My Lord, there is a lot to be fearful of. So little to count on. So my friends, take in words like, do not be afraid, I am your shield. Let that be a balm that just heals and strengthens you. It's appropriate for us both as individuals and as a church to ponder these words and Abraham's example and to ask, what are we to do while we are waiting for God to reconcile the world? I think our gospel lesson gives us a clue when Jesus says that he must be about his business of caring for others and casting out demons and healing the sick. Well, okay, so we don't routinely go around casting out demons these days, but we can still nurture people's spirits and feed their minds and feed their bellies and help them heal their bodies. In other words, while we are waiting for God's reconciliation of all creation, we're called to love and to tenderly care for God that is in each other and the world all around us. So, my friends, on some cold, clear evening in the next week or two, step out into the night and look up at those stars. And imagine what it must have been like for the old and childless Abraham to have God tell him that his offspring would be as plentiful as all those stars. Indeed they are, and we're some of them. God kept God's promise to the faithful Abraham. And God will keep God's promise to us as well. Amen.